Welcome to Identity Inside Out, Getting ID Right, a special InnovationOz.com podcast series brought to you by SailPoint. The last 2 years have seen unparalleled forces drive change. The setting of an unprecedented stage for a work-from-anywhere culture, coupled with an equal evolution of digital services and an ever-evolving, sophisticated cyber threat landscape. The corresponding response to this shift has been a continued focus on complying with the ASD Essential 8 and amendments to the Critical Infrastructure Act, imposing tighter guidelines and increasing cybersecurity requirements. While technology is an enabler, focus is renewed on facilitating change without impact. In this podcast series, we explore the controversies, perils, and opportunities that face industry in the midst of change, and how the organizations today are going to secure their virtual borders against the attacks of tomorrow.
Welcome to Identity Inside and Out, Getting ID Right, an InnovationOz.com podcast series with SailPoint. In today's episode, Connected Infrastructure, I'm talking to Claire Pales, who's the director of the Secure Board, and Gary Savarino, identity strategist at SailPoint. Welcome to both of you. Okay, today we're talking about connected critical infrastructure and connected devices, which, whilst providing huge benefits, is also creating a very wild and woolly environment when we're trying to secure our organisations. There's been a lot of discussion about recent changes to the critical infrastructure legislation, which really is now encompassing many more organisations who are really bound by law now to make sure that they are treating their critical infrastructure environments as a very important priority from a cyber perspective. So welcome to both of you for what I am sure is going to be a very interesting conversation, Gary and Claire.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Corey.
So there's been a lot of talk about this legislation, and I think the first thing is it's very broad and there's lots of things in there. And when we talk now about what was covered by critical infrastructure legislation, we saw particularly through the pandemic that people understood exactly how fragile supply chains were and what those little critical slivers look like in those in lots of areas, and that could be anywhere from retail to health, etc. I might start with you, Gary. Have the conversations that you're having changed since COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what COVID has really done is it's transformed everyone's lives, not just for the reasons that we're aware of, but also from a technology perspective. Organizations response to the pandemic was immediate. We saw an immediately transformed workforce overnight, offices locked down, and people confined to working from home. So organizations had to respond to that. They had to maintain their productivity and business continuity, and sought all sorts of ways, particularly from a technology perspective, to enable that workforce.
And Claire, obviously, boards and IT and cyber leadership really were dealing with a rapidly changing environment. Do you think there's been lots of obviously talk over many years about whether boards really understand what risk looks like? Has that kept pace? Have we had a quickening of understanding in terms of what risk might look like in this newer environment?
I think there's many. The challenge we've got is that every board is different and every organisation is different, and the context of that for each business changes every day. And what we've seen, I guess, over the last 2 years, and very much so in the last few months, is organisations seeing what other businesses are doing and asking questions around, are we covered for that? Are we exposed to that? And rushing to remote workforces and not sure whether those people are going to come back or not. So there's lots and lots of moving parts at the moment for boards, and trying to get their head around just that has been a challenge. And then the new legislation, in some instances, I haven't seen boards really pricking their ears up and wondering if they're a part of it or not, because there is so much else going on. But also we continue to see cybersecurity leaders or CIOs, whoever's responsible for cyber risk, not getting enough time in front of the board for the board to ask questions if they've got them. So getting cyber onto these agendas of boards and audit and risk committees even on a more regular basis would allow for the conversation to unfold more. But what we're really seeing with boards are a lot of them are still asking the 101 questions around Are we secure? Should we pay the ransom? What's our cyber insurance covering us for? Those types of questions, and probably not enough of the questions around these new legislative changes that are happening, because that's another step ahead, I think, in some cases.
It's interesting, is it? So it's designed, I guess, to reframe how we think about critical infrastructure, and sort of challenge people to think about their role, in supply chains and the ecosystem. But it's probably a slow burn for those pennies to drop, from the sounds of it.
Yeah, I think so. And the original group of critical infrastructure providers who were part of the legislation before the changes are well versed in managing critical infrastructure risk, not just cyber risk, but all sorts of risk, floods and fires and interruptions and supply chain issues when it comes to critical infrastructure at ports or in electricity companies. But when you now look at the expanded list out to 11, some of those groups, like universities or retailers, it might be not as easy for them to understand whether or not they're covered, and to get themselves to a level where they feel comfortable is probably going to need external advice, probably external legal advice, for them to really get an understanding of, are we part of this legislation? And if we are, then what changes do we need to make over a period of time to make sure that we're comfortable that we're meeting the expectations of the legislation? It's quite a complex conversation to be having, especially for organisations that before would never have considered themselves as critical infrastructure. But moving through the pandemic, obviously we found that they were critical, and that can change as well. In some states where we have floods and fires, in other states we don't, some of those providers might become critical, whereas in other states they're not. So it really is a challenge, I think, not only for boards but for management to work out where to make these investments.
It's a really interesting point. And so, Gary, I know a lot of your work over the years has been in the financial services sector, where people understand the implications of financial services, not being taken offline if we're not able to bank. And then to the other extreme, like, is toilet paper critical? And we saw people getting very nervous about, that was a real wake-up call in terms of thinking around what is critical in terms of how many days supply of food, or obviously the water, and you've mentioned sort of the natural disasters as well as part of that mix. But have you seen, Gary, any of that kind of transfer of some of the maturity or the learnings from the financial services sector and some of that earlier legislation, and how people are kind of reframing it with what we're seeing now in critical infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, from our experiences, financial services in Australia has really kind of, adopted a level of maturity that's similar to other financial services organizations globally. And a lot of that was due to the introduction of SOX compliance back in 2002, implementing those better controls around who has access to what in those organizations, in particular financial systems, and, being able to prevent fraud as well. But what we've seen is, whilst financial services were probably some of the earliest adopters of strict controls and security, in particular around identity, what we have seen also through the expanded list of 11, that now fall under the security critical infrastructure, like healthcare. For example, their maturity levels aren't at the same level as financial services. As an example, there's been some common sentiment among some groups that we've been discussing the topic with that, healthcare, as an example, is 10 to 15 years behind in terms of technology and maturity and security behind that of financial services.
That's a big gap if you're talking about like making up ground and keeping pace with the changes in the way that healthcare is delivered. But that is, Claire, do you see that there's certain industries where they're paying catch up, and as well as just having an incredibly changed environment over the past few years?
Yeah, and I think I'd add to what Gary said around financial services, firstly, that not all financial services companies are regulated. And so APRA has a small group that are regulated, but then there are thousands of other smaller financial services organisations who don't have the pressure of regulation and are also trying to catch up, because they are in the supply chain often of the bigger fin services companies. And with the pressure of the APRA regulation a few years ago and the supply chain or third-party risk management lens, they have had to try to catch up as well. So it's within financial services that the catch-up is happening. But also from a healthcare perspective, I've certainly seen peer CISOs of mine in the industry be employed by healthcare service providers. We've seen not-for-profits start to really focus on the healthcare information they might be collecting and how do they get the right resources inside their organisation who can focus on that as well. But they have to be risk-based investments. And so that needs to look through things like budgets and where you're going to spend that money, and borrowing from one area that might be really important for you to spend money on in order to put it into cyber as well. So it is going to be a slow burn, and organisations will play catch up. The point is we want to see them waking up to it and having a focus on it. Even if it's a slow burn, it's better than sort of thinking that it won't happen to them.
This is obviously very top of mind this week. Australia has had some very high-profile breaches in recent weeks. I was talking to someone in Singapore yesterday that says Australia's not alone. There's a hospital in India as we speak that's using paper and pen. It's every country is having its own very high-profile and disruptive breaches, and with that, if you just have to listen to breakfast radio, the ripple effect that it's causing from a social perspective is actually quite profound. You know, we heard this morning that there has been more information released onto the dark web, people feeling very vulnerable. How does that, from a board perspective particularly, Claire, do people now understand that when you're talking about risk, the risk is greater than financial? It's now a whole kind of social ripple effect that's actually reframing these challenges when it comes to kind of elevating the discussion.
Definitely. We're seeing at a board level a couple of things in relation to that question. One is that a lot of boards think that if they buy cyber insurance, then the financial support that cyber insurance will give them will get them hopefully out of the situation that they might be in from a cyber incident perspective. There are other boards that think that the only cost of a cyber incident is to pay a ransom. And so if they don't pay the ransom, then the cost of mopping up will be minimal. And we know that that's definitely not the case. And also, not every cyber incident is a ransomware or involves a ransom demand. So from a cost perspective, there are so many costs involved in mopping up a cybersecurity incident. And we really want to see boards to realise that that investment needs to be thought through in a much bigger way than just buying an insurance product and hoping that that will be the solution to all of their problems. From a community perspective, we're definitely seeing people now much, much more aware and quite fearful, I think, of the data that might have been disclosed about them. Certainly the health data that we've seen, but also driver's license and passport. So I was talking to someone last week about ESG, so environment, social and governance, and where data security fits inside that. And it sits inside, if you think about the regular frameworks, it sits inside the social or under the S. But it could also just as easily sit under governance and from a board perspective should be. But the social implications of a data breach go far beyond just the loss of a driver's license or the health data. We saw with Colonial Pipeline, people couldn't go places. You know, there was no petrol along that coastal area of America last year. So the social implications of not being able to drive places, not being able to fuel ambulances and taxis, and you know, it's that impact as well as the personal data that people might have been impacted by. And we may see that also move into things like water supply chain, electricity supply chain. The social implications of that could be incredible.
Mm. And even another aspect of the social, and Gary, keen for your thoughts here as well, is just even if you look generationally at the number of people who weren't born as digital natives, who often find kind of online environments quite daunting anyway, and then compound that with the sense that, you know, information's been stolen, and, you know, you really are dealing, you can see a real kind of bifurcation, if you like, of people who would be disproportionately affected by an environment that is kind of hostile because of this stuff. So I think we have a real feeling about that in this country right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, through, my conversations with, different individuals throughout these organizations potentially that have been impacted by the breaches. It's interesting to hear the feedback on the response from the various generations. The older generations are, not digital natives. There's a lot more concern around their data, what it means for them personally, and also from a social perspective. But on the flip side of that, the younger generations, the digital natives, I guess in line with how much information they're putting out there about themselves anyway, there's less concern for them, which I think is a bit of an interesting mix, and how to appease, I guess, all of those that have been affected by some of the largest data breaches we've had.
To go back to some of the more practical elements, because we know, you've mentioned some of the natural disasters, Claire, the floods and fires, and we're talking about critical infrastructure. And we now know that all of this sort of connectedness and ability for sensors and IoT devices and this sort of generation of huge amounts of insight, but also we're now, like in terms of the fabric with which there are areas to be, entered by bad actors, we're now talking about a dramatically different landscape. So the signal to noise, both in terms of things that are important for managing critical assets, but secondly, the skills crisis in this country at a time where it sounds like it's more important than ever, those cyber skills are at an absolute premium. So how are we seeing the balance between, the technology that's able to kind of use the people skills where the noise is, or the signal is that needs the attention?
Yeah, I can see that a lot of organisations might put their thoughts and their investment now into technology to try to help them to detect or monitor their systems and detect if there are issues. And the problem with that is that we need people, as you just mentioned, sitting on the other end of those technologies. So logging and monitoring and automation and getting technology to do some of the heavy lifting for us is a good investment, as long as we've got people inside our organisation that can view that information and work out whether and what it means, essentially, and not just put tech in place and hope that it will save us and it will do the job that that we're sold it will do. So I feel like there's an opportunity to slow down a little bit, take a deep breath, not panic about what's going on within Australia and globally. And it's been going on globally for a long time. I think we've just seen a big flurry of activity here in Australia, and it has made people really concerned. So if we could slow down the thinking a little bit and take a deep breath and look inside our organisations at what are we trying to protect? What is our critical information? What level of sensitivity is that information? Where is that information? And how do we understand who's got access to it as well? Making sure we've got a really thorough view of that, and then working out how we're going to protect it. And if it is in places we don't want it to be, if it's overseas or if it's with third parties that we don't have a trusted relationship with, how are we going to claw that information back and make sure that it's secure? So I think people shouldn't move too rapidly and shouldn't make too many rash decisions right now. We need to make sure that we're thinking this through and having really robust conversations about what data have we got and why do we have it? Where is it? Who's got access to it? And then putting together a very clear plan that involves technology but also involves some pretty serious people change management to protect that information and know where it is and who's got access to it. I think the other piece around the skills crisis is probably a bigger conversation for another day, but there are very clear areas within cybersecurity where we're lacking the skills, and we're trying, I think, to bring people through universities, but there's also an opportunity for people within organisations to learn more about this topic and lift their cyber literacy rather than us just looking at the cybersecurity team or the information security team as the people who will save the business. Everybody in the business, including the board, need to lift their literacy on this topic. And it's not just reading one book or doing one course. This is an ongoing activity that organisations need to invest in.
I'm going to come to you in a sec, Gary, but on that point, I find it fascinating. We were speaking to someone from Box Hill TAFE the other day, and I always kind of thought Box Hill TAFE, because they're quite, vocational in that cyber stream. But the interesting thing was it wasn't actually people doing cyber and then going to be cyber professionals. It was people being exposed to cyber and then working in a wide range of businesses where they took some exposure into those businesses. And that was what was actually creating the uplift. So to your point, just more people with, and I guess, micro-credentialing that have...
Yeah, definitely.
Gary, sorry. Gary, just coming to you, and I think Claire makes an excellent point about where we get the kind of the human and the technology working together, that we're really using the best of both. That's obviously something that you see being implemented, daily. Are there any kind of tips or recommendations or observations that you've seen about companies that have really maximised their people and use the technology in a really smart way?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, Claire, I think some of that what you just said, some of the best advice I've ever heard on how we're really, to tackle the current landscape there. So very, very considered and very well spoken there on that topic. I think I couldn't agree more with one particular fact around people, and from a technology perspective, we're engaging with organizations. I think this is very common, for a lot of organizations that are selling technology to their end customers, is that technology is not a silver bullet to address a problem. It wholeheartedly relies on people to be able to do something with it. So it is about the investment in the people as well. And of course, we have seen, a bit of a gap in the skills around cybersecurity in particular today. Welcome any investment in that area from organizations and government as well, in terms of upskilling the community to become more cyber aware as well. When we're working with organizations, a big part of what we do is to ensure that there is that literacy around the technology that we're talking about, and making sure that at least we have an ability to be able to educate our customers on the I guess the most efficient and proper use of that technology, and how to best implement that and protect as well. I think as vendors, or being one of the vendors in the cybersecurity space, I think there is almost a responsibility on our part to make sure that it's more than just selling a solution. It is about ensuring that the customers that we do engage with have a clear path in order to get value out of that investment, and that it is going to add that layer of protection that they're looking for as well. So almost I'll say a corporate responsibility on our part as vendors to make sure that the organizations that we are working with do get the value, and I guess that that promise of what the technology is for. But again, if there isn't the investment on the other side as well, in terms of people and being able to continue to work with the technology, it's the old problem of people, process, and technology. They do need to work together.
So we're rounding out a year, like we're crashing into 2023. Can I just get a sense from you? It seems to be a bit of a very busy year this year, in terms of, it's the first year really where we've sort of started to see sort of a return to something a bit more stable after COVID, in terms of work, how people are working, all the things we talked about re-examining how we think about critical infrastructure and supply chains and all of those things. What are we thinking about is the next phase when we're talking about securing our organisations? Like, we've had a very real threat in recent months. We've had big picture kind of changes to the way we live and work. What do you, Claire, from what you're seeing in terms of, obviously there's a bit of catch up to do in some pockets of the sorts of organisations you're working with. Others are more mature than others, but where are we headed, do you think? What's in store for the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. So what I'd like to see over the next 6 to 12 months is organisations, as I mentioned before, really taking a deep breath on this topic and making some time for it, not paying lip service to it, not asking small questions throughout the year or signing off a strategy and then hoping that gets delivered, but really building cyber into the fabric of how people do business. And I know that probably sounds like a bit of a cliche, but we've built safety in, we've spent the last 20 or 30 years really building safety into organisations. You wouldn't watch somebody walk onto a building site these days without a hard hat and steel cap boots. Cyber is so virtual and so difficult for people to understand because you can't see it, it's not tangible. But we can certainly see the tangible impacts of a cybersecurity incident or an event, the way that we've seen them in the last few months. So I would like to see in the coming 12 months people having many more conversations about cybersecurity, and that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to talk about events that have happened, or someone who's clicked on a phishing link and caused an issue to happen, or somebody who's left the gate open, as people are using that term at the moment. It's not an easy conversation to have, but if we start to normalise that over the next 12 months, because it's normal in other countries to be having these conversations, because that's what they're used to. So let's really try in Australia to have a look at where can we inject these conversations? How can we bring cyber further forward in the process, and for it not to be an afterthought? And, personally, Anna Leibel, who's my business partner, and I, we have a real mission and a vision that we want everyone on boards, to start having an ongoing cybersecurity conversation. We really want it to not be twice a year, or, someone who stands up at a town hall or a strategy day once, but it to be an ongoing conversation for boards. That idea that, a rising tide lifts all boats. Get everybody talking about this subject, get everybody aware, and so that it's not just a handful of people that we're grappling to share skills of in the cybersecurity industry, trying to manage it, but it's everybody. We wouldn't say, well, safety's not your responsibility, or the budget's not your responsibility. Everybody takes responsibility for other parts of organisational operations, and cyber needs to become just like that, a way of doing business for organisations in Australia.
Gary, before I come to you, I just have another question, Claire, because completely accept that it needs to be everybody's challenge. But from a board perspective, does that director's liability, has that not made people kind of really hyper-vigilant to where their exposure might be on boards? Is that?
Yes, and I think joining boards has become a more scary proposition over the last few years or few decades as new things come into play. So in the past, you could be a board director and have come from an accounting background or a legal background, or even as a CEO or operations, and bring a wealth of knowledge to your seat as a director. But these days, we've got climate change, we've got modern slavery, we've got cyber. There are so many new challenges for directors that they have to learn about. They can't bring 20 years of operational experience to the table on this topic. And if they can, chances are there are other areas of their skill sets that won't meet what a director needs. So I feel like it is a scary proposition, I think, for some people to move into the boardroom now who maybe don't have that skill set. But every director has a responsibility to have the skills that they need, and over time will build that experience. So I understand what you're saying, but to be a director in these kind of modern times, there are more than just balance sheets and legal liability, performance and solvency to be worried about. There are climate change and cyber, which have performance and solvency issues about them, and that's where the director's mindset should be at. But they need a bit more information to manage cyber risk than they do to manage maybe the financial risks that they're used to.
A very interesting conversation. It's a dramatically changed environment, and there's lots to keep up. Gary, over to you. What do you think we'll see, or what would you like to see in the next 12 months or so?
Yeah, I guess firstly, the one thing I really strongly agree with that Claire mentioned there was around the normalization of cybersecurity just becoming part of the conversation. When we think technology, where is the fit, or where does cyber come into play as part of any technology initiative within organizations? Thinking back to many years ago when I was involved, more from a hands on the keyboard technology perspective. Any business initiative that we worked on had the standard, what is your disaster recovery plan? What is your high availability around this? They were introduced over time as well as organizations started to experience issues with their services. So it took some time for those things to become normalized. And I think we're absolutely at the point, well past the point, in fact, where cyber needs to become part of the same, needs to be another step in that process of any business initiative or onboarding any new technologies into an organization. So I think moving into the future, I'll absolutely, next 6 to 12 months, there's definitely a lot of conversation around cybersecurity and what that means. Of course, we're we've seen already a huge uplift in the number of conversations we're having with that expanded scope of organizations that fall on security critical infrastructure as well. And we'll no doubt start to see, those conversations turn into high maturity levels for a lot of those organizations as well. I don't think we're at the end of seeing what breaches can do for organizations. The latest Australian cybersecurity data breach report indicates that we're definitely not in the clear. Somewhere in the vicinity of 76,000 breaches in the last 12 months as well, for the period of 2021 to 22. So we're going to continue to see those increases occur. The increase also indicating we're seeing a breach reported every 8 minutes. Every 7 minutes, up from every 8 minutes in the previous year as well. So we will start seeing more and more of those conversations, more and more awareness around that, and hopefully, the conversation around cybersecurity just becomes part of standard business process as well.
You must be like this about the board stuff for years and years, and it kind of seems to move, and it doesn't, and it seems to move. Yeah. It's a long road, isn't it?
I think they've just got a lot on their plates as well. Personally, I wish they would be talking about cyber a lot, but they've got so many other plates spinning as a director, and some of them are on multiple boards, which is the other challenge, is that they're trying to think through, what does cyber mean on this telco board I'm on, and then what does cyber mean on this university board I'm on, or the soccer team board I'm on, or they have to be thinking through cyber risk at so many different levels and in different ways. And for new directors, that can be quite daunting, I think, but also for directors who have been around for a long time, who maybe feel like they've only got a few years left, and why would they bother? So it's across the whole gamut of different types and styles of directors that we're seeing a different level of concern. So I think that there are definitely challenges for directors now. And, at the moment, I'm not on any boards because I advise so many boards. I'm not ready, I don't think, for that level of responsibility. But Anna's on 2 boards, and the conversations are really complex.
Can I ask, this isn't off the record like this, I'm just curious, because I'm not sure if it's a feature of the way that previous government worked, but I always feel like anything I've ever seen of Home Affairs trying to do anything educationally around the critical infrastructure stuff seems tortured and bad. It's like if you're doing a wholesale change management type piece, which effectively that critical infrastructure legislation needs to be, like, it's so big and unwieldy, and that I just don't see that the government being able to effectively prosecute the risk to benefit, what does it mean for me? Like, I think there's been a few dusty town halls with some mid-level bureaucrats that could basically read from the legislation. I'm being unkind, but is that not a massive opportunity for collaboration?
It is. And I think before they released the legislation or into Parliament as a bill, there was a lot of public consultation and industry consultation. But I don't necessarily feel like all the people had a voice. And there's also just a big challenge around how many organisations now fall under that legislation. Because before, when it was just the 4, as I mentioned before, it was kind of ports and water and electricity and those types of groups. Yeah. Now to think that, companies that might retail, I don't know, plumbing tools or plumbing supplies in Queensland in the middle of a flood, they are critical infrastructure. Those shops need to open so people can get sandbags and pipes and, those types of things. But in the middle of Perth, where they might not really need to be open, like, is that critical? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a very complex piece of legislation. And if I think about how APRA have done things, they've deliberately kept CPS 234, for example, quite vague, because if they're prescriptive, it moves too fast. So, Gary, I'm interested in your opinion, definitely.
No, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think there is that level of vagueness, and the line about seek and your own legal advice for consultation to see if this applies to you. I mean, where does that leave organisations? As you mentioned, I mean, a plumbing store in Brisbane in the middle of a flood versus one in WA or in Perth with they're two different things, and they're facing completely different operating requirements. So, I mean, not only is the the element of vagueness in that legislation, tough to deal with. It's the additional confusion, I think, in terms of what data is being fed to organisations from a cybersecurity perspective. There's details coming down from ASD, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, critical infrastructure. And they all say different things. I mean, ASD, you look at the Essential 8, that's a list of 8 things with various maturity levels. And that is a bit more of a prescriptive model, but it's incredibly basic. I'm going to say, like, there's some really basic requirements there that really don't accommodate the sophisticated needs to tackle cybersecurity today, or the threat landscape. So there's that issue. There's another program that's been spun up by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre as well to assist critical infrastructure. We've now got the Red Spice program that has been released as well to tackle the nation's cybersecurity defence. So I think there's just too much information. It's too confusing. It's that element of not knowing where to start, which is why I guess the earlier kind of advice you provided, it's almost take a back to basics approach. Where is the sensitive data that your organization has? If my advice is always, where is your customer data located, and who has access to it? So let's start with that. And of course, you've got your employees as well. So it's just being able to identify what's important to the organization. I think if there was that level of advice, rather than, I guess, the convoluted messaging that comes out from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and the security of critical infrastructure, and if there was just a little bit more of a prescriptive model that kind of took a basics approach to the minimum needs that organizations should have, I think that would be a better starting point.
Yeah, I think the Essential 8 is really interesting because it's so heavily focused on technology as well. And again, you have to have people there to manage that. Like, you can't just put application whitelisting in place and then walk away. And multi-factor authentication, like all these things that they suggest in the Essential 8 are brilliant hygiene activities, but you can't implement that and have nobody there to manage it and operate it day to day. And, and that's why I say that we can't just be out there saying, oh, I can't hire an identity and access management analyst or engineer, or I can't hire a GRC person. We have to make these people. We can't just rely on the graduates from university, because they're not learning what they need to learn either, which is probably a podcast for another day too. But, I feel like the government is relying on organisations, in answer to your question, Corey, they're relying on organisations to make this work, to work this out for themselves, I think. And then they have to go and pay legal teams to work out, are we part of this legislation or are we not? And then they also have to pay Big Four consultancy companies to come in and sort of pre-audit them, so that when the auditors come, they know what they're going to say. So it's a really big challenge.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Claire Pales, Director of the Secure Board, and Gary Savarino, Identity Strategist at SailPoint. Thank you for the conversation today. It's been great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks, Claire. That was fantastic.
We hope you enjoyed this Identity Inside Out, Getting ID Right podcast, brought to you by SailPoint. For more, keep tuning in to innovationoz.com/podcasts or visit sailpoint.com.